Hey guys, tonight we're starting with medieval vegetables. I know, riveting stuff, but trust me, not these vegetables. So before you get too comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you.
It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Purslane was the kind of plant medieval authorities deeply distrusted, not because it poisoned people, caused riots, or worshipped the devil, but because it refused to behave like a proper crop. It didn't line up neatly in rows. It didn't wait for permission. It didn't even pretend to care who owned the land. Purslane simply appeared, like an uninvited guest who also happens to cook better than you. It thrived in drought. It shrugged at poor soil. It grew in cracks between stones, along roads, in courtyards, and occasionally in places that made people stare at the ground and say, "How is that even possible?" Medieval peasants didn't plant purslane.
That would have required trying. One day they spotted it, noticed it stubbornly survived despite everything stacked against it, and reasonably chose to eat it. That single choice already put purslane well ahead of most medieval problem-solving strategies. From a nutritional standpoint, purslane was almost absurdly rich. It was loaded with nutrients, minerals, and beneficial fats at a time when most meals were built from bread, disappointment, and anything boiled until it surrendered. It remained green while respectable vegetables wilted under even modest contact with reality. It asked for no fertilizer, no irrigation, and no encouragement whatsoever. It merely persisted, which in medieval farming counted as deeply questionable conduct. And this is where things got tricky. Food was meant to grow in fields. Fields were mapped. Fields were taxed. Fields came with rules. Purslane ignored all of that. It transformed roadsides into larders and walls into markets. No lord planted it. No priest sanctified it. No steward could tally it without kneeling awkwardly and admitting he'd lost all authority. So the authorities did what people always do when faced with something helpful yet bothersome. They labeled it a weed. Weed isn't a scientific term. It's an emotional reaction. It says, this plant thrives too easily and refuses to follow the rules. Meanwhile, monastic gardens quietly cultivated purslane because monks valued a plant that didn't perish just to be difficult. Medical guides recommended it. Healers employed it. But peasants consuming it without restraint felt threatening. A peasant who didn't rely on grain was a peasant who stayed calm during famines, and calm peasants have always made those in charge uneasy. So purslane wasn't loudly forbidden. It was quietly overlooked, deliberately neglected, and politely ridiculed. Uprooting a plant that appears everywhere is difficult. Convincing people it has no value is far simpler. And purslane, as stubborn as ever, kept flourishing regardless, patiently waiting for humans to realize their error. Salsify was never showy. It didn't demand notice. It didn't grow in bold, conspicuous clusters. In fact, if you went by looks alone, you'd think it had already lost. Above ground, salsify appeared thin, unremarkable, and almost apologetic, like a plant that had arrived in the medieval food world knowing it wouldn't be taken seriously. Beneath the soil, however, salsify was quietly flourishing. Its long, resilient root drove deep into the earth, sheltered from frost, drought, hungry animals, and the everyday disorder of medieval agriculture. While other crops wilted at the first hint of bad weather, salsify carried on unbothered beneath the ground, gathering nutrients and waiting for someone clever enough to unearth it. Medieval peasants grasped this quickly. Salsify didn't require fertile soil. It didn't ask for constant care. It didn't fall apart at the first cold spell. You planted it once and largely forgot about it. which made it remarkably efficient and, unfortunately, deeply unsettling. Because here's the issue. Medieval farming systems adored visible labor. They favored fields that could be inspected, measured, taxed, and admired by passing officials who needed reassurance of their own importance. Salsify stayed hidden. You couldn't easily judge how much was growing. You couldn't tell who had more. You couldn't frighten peasants by threatening their crops when half of the harvest was literally underground, quietly minding its own affairs. Worse still, salsify was nourishing. It offered carbohydrates, minerals, and enough sustenance to carry people through lean months without pleading for grain from central stores. This was not the intention. The intention relied on peasants being hungry, anxious, and emotionally primed for obedience. Medical writers praised salsify as strengthening and restorative, which should have been a compliment, but instead only deepened its air of suspicion. Food that actively restored health reduced the need for costly treatments and charitable relief, and medieval power structures were deeply invested in remaining indispensable. So salsify faded from prominence not through prohibitions or grand announcements, but through deliberate indifference. It was branded unfashionable, outdated, a food for hard times, something eaten only when nothing better was available, which conveniently discouraged anyone from admitting it worked just fine. Above ground, salsify stayed modest and easily overlooked. Below ground, it reliably sustained people through winters and lean years, and like many things in medieval history, it wasn't discarded because it failed, it disappeared because it succeeded too quietly to be managed. Lovage was the medieval equivalent of that one person who excelled at everything and was therefore quietly resented. It functioned as a vegetable, an herb, and a medicine all at once, which already put it at odds with anyone who favored neat categories and firm control. Lovage ignored boundaries. It seasoned food, soothed stomach troubles, eased aches, and returned year after year as if it held a permanent claim on the soil. By herb standards, it was enormous, tall, leafy, and self-assured. You didn't need much because lovage was strong. A small amount went a long way, which immediately raised suspicion. Medieval systems preferred crops that demanded constant labor, constant supervision, and regular reminders of who held authority. Lovage simply appeared and performed. Peasants adored it. It made bland meals feel less like a sentence. It helped digestion after diets built mostly from bread and hope.
It also lessened dependence on apothecaries, healers, and monastic medicine stores, which was convenient for peasants and deeply uncomfortable for institutions that preferred to be the exclusive source of relief. Medical writers praised lovage without hesitation. It was recommended for bloating, pain, and general bodily misery, which, in medieval life, covered almost everything. Monasteries cultivated it safely behind walls, where knowledge could be regulated and distributed on their terms. But peasants growing lovage freely in their own gardens felt excessive, borderline empowering. Lovage also had the nerve to improve the land itself. It drew helpful insects, shaded the soil, and coexisted politely with nearby plants. This was not how farming was meant to function. Crops were supposed to struggle. Struggle justified hierarchy. A plant that made life easier weakened the story. There was also the problem of superstition. Lovage carried associations with love, attraction, and emotional well-being, all of which made medieval authorities uneasy. Anything that encouraged joy, comfort, or confidence among peasants was automatically suspect. Happy people tended to ask questions, so lovage wasn't dramatically outlawed. No one stormed gardens issuing decrees. Instead, it was slowly reframed as excessive, outdated, or medicinal rather than culinary, useful in small doses, preferably under oversight. Peasants adjusted, as they always did. Over time, lovage drifted to the edges, vaguely remembered, quietly used, and eventually replaced by milder, more controllable substitutes. Not because lovage posed a danger, but because it made people too comfortable. And comfort, historically speaking, has always unsettled those in power.
Scarrot was sweet, starchy, and embarrassingly dependable, three qualities that immediately conflicted with medieval agricultural ideals. It produced clusters of long, pale roots that became pleasantly sugary when cooked, which made them suspiciously enjoyable. Food, according to medieval logic, was not meant to be enjoyable unless you were extremely wealthy or extremely drunk. Scarrot thrived in cold regions and tolerated wet ground, frost, and neglect with quiet assurance. While other crops sulked and failed at the slightest inconvenience, scarrot continued growing underground as if it had accepted winter as a personal challenge. It didn't require fertile soil. It didn't demand constant attention. It didn't unravel during bad years. It simply appeared when people needed it most. Naturally, peasants adored it. Scarrot filled stomachs during grain shortages. It provided calories without reliance on lord-controlled bread supplies. It grew where wheat stubbornly refused to cooperate. And worst of all, it rewarded patience rather than labor. You planted it once and waited, which meant peasants weren't always visible, exhausted, and obedient in the fields. That final point was deeply unsettling. Medieval systems favored crops that demanded constant care. Care kept people occupied. Occupied people didn't organize, complain, or notice that their landlord controlled most of the heat and all of the firewood. Scarrot broke that pattern. It quietly offered nourishment without endless misery, which was, frankly, an unacceptable business model. Even elite households enjoyed scarrot. It appeared in noble kitchens, admired for its sweetness and adaptability. But when a food appealed to both peasants and elites, it created an uncomfortable overlap, and medieval society was built entirely on separation. So scarrot began to be reframed as rustic, outdated, unsophisticated, something you ate only when better options were gone, even though everyone knew it tasted good. This social demotion made it easier to abandon scarrot without acknowledging the real issue. It worked too well. Over time, it was replaced by crops that demanded more labor, more fertilizer, and more centralized control. Crops that failed loudly and predictably, ensuring people remained properly anxious. Scarrot didn't vanish because it was fragile, it vanished because it was reliable, and in medieval agriculture, reliability in the wrong hands was dangerous. Good King Henry, despite the name, was not named after a benevolent ruler. There was no crown, no castle, no tragic lineage. Medieval people simply had a habit of calling useful things good, usually shortly before someone decided they were inconvenient, and Good King Henry was very inconvenient. This leafy green thrived near homes, along paths, beside manure heaps, and in soils that made other vegetables give up entirely. It didn't need a field, it didn't require a plow, it didn't ask for approval. Good King Henry followed people rather than property lines, which immediately raised suspicion. Peasants treated it like a dependable neighbor. The leaves were eaten like spinach, the shoots were cooked like asparagus, the seeds could even be ground into flour during desperate times. One plant, many meals, minimal effort. Medieval efficiency at its finest, and also its undoing. Because here was the problem. Food was supposed to come from land that could be measured, taxed, and threatened. Good King Henry grew in marginal spaces, edges, corners, forgotten patches of ground where authority was weakest. You couldn't easily regulate it without regulating existence itself. It also returned year after year. Once established, it came back faithfully, offering food without demanding constant labor, and medieval systems preferred constant labor. Labor justified hierarchy. A plant that reduced toil was practically an act of defiance. To make matters worse, Good King Henry had medicinal uses. It eased digestion, reduced inflammation, and generally made people feel slightly less miserable.
Plants that made life easier always attracted suspicion. Comfort led to confidence, and confidence historically led to inconvenient questions. So the response wasn't an outright ban, that would have required effort. Instead, good King Henry was slowly rebranded as a weed, untidy, uncultured, something respectable people didn't grow on purpose. Once labeled undesirable, it quietly disappeared from managed gardens, even as it continued to grow stubbornly wherever humans tried to overlook it. Over time, newer crops replaced it, crops that demanded careful planting, fertilizing, and supervision, crops that failed dramatically when neglected, crops that reminded people exactly how dependent they were. Good King Henry didn't fail, it was dismissed, and like many things in medieval history, it didn't disappear because it was bad, it disappeared because it was too good at making life bearable. Groundnut was the kind of crop that made medieval authorities uneasy, mostly because it was far too clever for its own good. While respectable plants insisted on growing above ground where everyone could see them, groundnut chose discretion. It climbed politely as a vine above the soil while quietly forming nutritious tubers below, hidden, protected, and entirely none of anyone's business. This plant flourished in poor soil, endured drought, and treated pests as minor inconveniences.
It required no fertilizer, it asked for no irrigation, it didn't need constant watching, which meant peasants could grow it, harvest it, and eat it without requesting help or permission, an immediate warning sign. The tubers themselves were dense with protein and calories, a risky combination when the objective was keeping people dependent. Grain shortages caused panic. Groundnut reduced panic. Less panic encouraged clear thinking, and clear thinking has historically led to inconvenient outcomes. Worse still, groundnut stored exceptionally well. It could be harvested quietly and left hidden in the earth until needed. That meant it wasn't always visible during inspections. Medieval officials preferred crops they could see. Visibility felt like control. Groundnut simply chuckled beneath the soil. Because the plant climbed rather than spread, it never looked impressive. No dramatic fields, no obvious abundance, just an unassuming vine going about its business while secretly feeding families through difficult seasons. Authorities often dismissed it as trivial, which allowed it to persist even longer. But that same invisibility sealed its fate. Crops that couldn't be easily counted couldn't be easily taxed, and anything that complicated taxation inevitably earned a bad name. Groundnut was gradually labeled unreliable, wild, or unsuitable for proper agriculture, despite sustaining people effectively for generations. Over time, it was replaced by crops that were simpler to monitor and quicker to fail, crops that broadcast their suffering loudly when conditions weren't ideal, crops that reminded peasants exactly how fragile their food supply truly was. Groundnut didn't vanish because it was fragile, it vanished because it was discreet. And in medieval systems of power, discretion was unacceptable. Food was expected to be visible, measurable, and conveniently vulnerable. Groundnut offered nourishment without spectacle, and that, historically, is how useful things quietly disappear. Sorrel was sharp, sour, and unapologetically direct, which already made it troublesome. Its lemony bite cut straight through the medieval routine of bread, gruel, and quiet resignation. One taste woke your mouth. Stews improved. For a brief moment, food felt like more than survival. Naturally, this caused discomfort. Sorrel grew everywhere. Fields, meadows, forest edges, roadsides. If soil existed, sorrel traded it as optional. It thrived in poor conditions, survived frost, and returned year after year with the confidence of a plant that knew it couldn't be stopped. Peasants loved it because it made awful food tolerable and bad food edible. It also did something far more dangerous. It made spoiled food safer. Sorrel's acidity helped preserve meals and disguise unpleasant flavors. When meat was questionable, sorrel helped. When milk soured, sorrel helped. When bread had developed opinions, sorrel helped. This reduced waste, illness, and reliance on official food supplies, which, once again, was not the intention.
Medieval medical writers praised sorrel for cooling the body, easing fevers, and improving digestion. In other words, it made people healthier. Healthier peasants needed fewer remedies, fewer pilgrimages, and fewer charitable interventions. Institutions rarely enjoy becoming less essential. Sorrel also grew wild, meaning peasants didn't need fields or permission to gather it, and that was the real concern. Foraging occupied a legal gray zone, tolerated during extreme hunger, discouraged when authority needed reinforcing. A plant that fed people without rent or oversight made that gray zone uncomfortably wide. So, sorrel acquired a reputation: too sharp, too acidic, too stimulating. Physicians warned that excessive consumption could disturb the humors, a wonderfully flexible accusation that could be applied to anything inconvenient. If peasants ate too much sorrel, the story went, they might become excitable or worse, opinionated. Over time, sorrel was nudged to the edges, not banned outright, but reframed as rustic, excessive, or medicinal rather than culinary, something to use sparingly, if at all, something associated with hardship rather than daily life. But sorrel never truly vanished. It lingered in hedges, crept back into pots during lean years, and reminded people that flavor, resilience, and survival often grow together. Sorrel didn't disappear because it was harsh. It faded because it made difficult conditions easier to endure, and history has never been especially fond of that.
Cardoon looked like a plant that had argued with civilization, lost, and decided to grow anyway. Tall, thorny, and openly hostile, it resembled something better suited to guarding a wall than feeding a household, which, paradoxically, was exactly why it succeeded. Cardoon was related to the artichoke, but far tougher and far less interested in being admired. It flourished in poor soil, tolerated drought, ignored pests, and grew into enormous plants that produced edible stalks and leaves for months on end. It didn't require coddling, it didn't ask for fertilizer, it didn't even need encouragement. It simply spread, confidently occupying space as if it had permanent rights. Peasants valued this. Cardoon provided food when other vegetables failed, especially in dry regions where respectable crops gave up almost immediately. It stored well, cooked well, and fed entire households with very little effort. By every practical measure, it was inconveniently effective. Authorities, however, saw something different: disorder. Cardoon didn't grow neatly. It ignored boundaries. It didn't look disciplined. Medieval farming preferred plants that stayed in rows, behaved predictably, and visually reinforced the idea that humans were in charge. Cardoon fused all of that. It looked wild even when deliberately cultivated, which made it deeply unsettling to anyone invested in order. Its sheer size was another concern. Large plants suggested abundance, and abundance in peasant hands made elites uneasy. A wheat field could fail and remind everyone who controlled grain. A patch of cardoon kept feeding people regardless of weather, which was frankly impolite. There was also the question of taste and refinement. Medieval elites prized elegance, and cardoon offered none. It required preparation, peeling, soaking, patience, skills peasants had in abundance. Labeling it coarse and unpleasant was easier than admitting it was reliable. So cardoon gradually slipped out of favor. It wasn't formally outlawed, it was sidelined, replaced by crops that were easier to regulate, easier to fail, and easier to justify controlling. Over time, cardoon became odd, exotic, or forgotten, despite once being a staple. But cardoon never sought approval. It kept growing wherever it could, spines out, leaves wide, quietly reminding the world that resilience doesn't require elegance. Cardoon wasn't removed because it was dangerous, it was removed because it refused to behave, and history has always preferred plants and people that stay in line. Rampion was a plant that excelled where expectations were minimal: rocky ground, thin soil, neglected plots. Rampion treated these not as problems but as invitations. While more delicate crops demanded rich land and constant care, Rampion grew quietly in places medieval farmers had already dismissed as useless. Naturally, peasants paid attention. Rampion produced edible roots and leaves, which immediately made it suspiciously generous. One plant, two food sources, very little effort. In medieval agriculture, generosity without labor raised concerns. Rampion didn't need fertilizer. It didn't collapse during bad seasons. It simply endured, feeding people in marginal lands where authorities had little interest or control. That independence was the real problem. Rampion allowed communities to survive on land that wasn't closely monitored, taxed, or even clearly owned. It thrived on edges, both literal and political. When people could feed themselves from forgotten hillsides, the entire structure of controlled food production began to look optional. Rampion also rewarded patience rather than constant work. You planted it, waited, and harvested when ready. That meant peasants weren't always visible in fields under watchful eyes. Medieval systems valued visibility. If people were out of sight, they might be thinking, and thinking has historically led to trouble. There was also symbolism to contend with. Rampion became tied to rural independence and folk tradition. Songs, stories, and regional dishes celebrated it. Anything that encouraged identity outside centralized authority caused quiet concern. Cultural confidence is often the first step toward inconvenient opinions. So Rampion was rebranded. It became rustic, backward, and eventually obsolete. New crops promised higher yields paired with greater dependency. Rampion was gently pushed aside not because it failed, but because it didn't fit the story of progress.
Later folklore would preserve rampion in fairy tales, usually as a warning: eat rampion and consequences follow. A plant that once quietly sustained the poor was transformed into a moral lesson about knowing one's place. Very subtle, very effective. Rampion vanished from fields and tables, replaced by crops that demanded better land, better tools, and closer supervision. Crops that constantly reminded people who controlled survival. But rampion never truly left. It still grows in forgotten places, just as it always has, waiting, thriving, unimpressed. Rampion didn't disappear because it was fragile. It disappeared because it made neglected land valuable. And systems built on scarcity have always found that deeply uncomfortable. Alexander's roots were once everywhere, which is precisely why almost no one remembers them now. Long before carrots dominated medieval kitchens and confidently marched into modern supermarkets, Alexander's roots performed the same role, only with less spectacle and more quiet reliability. This plant thrived in poor soil, tolerated cold, and demanded very little attention. Its roots were edible, its leaves were useful, and it had the irritating habit of growing wherever people preferred not to think too carefully about farming. In other words, it worked. Alexander's roots appeared in monastery gardens, village plots, and roadside margins, feeding people dependably without requiring endless labor. Once again, that was the problem. Crops that behave too well reduce urgency, and urgency is the foundation of control. Carrots, by contrast, were far more theatrical. They required better soil, careful tending, and close attention. They responded beautifully to selective breeding, allowing authorities to standardize them, manage seed supplies, and quantify yields. Alexander's roots refused to participate in that vision. They didn't become uniform. They didn't improve on demand. They simply remained useful, and usefulness without obedience was unacceptable. They also suffered from poor branding, old, familiar, tied to the countryside rather than progress. History excels at forgetting things that don't market well. Over time, Alexander's roots were displaced by crops that looked brighter, cleaner, and more manageable, crops that fit neatly into rows and economic models, crops that failed loudly when systems required compliance. Alexander's roots didn't fail, they were replaced. And replacement in history is often the polite form of removal. Today, Alexander's roots survive mostly as footnotes, quiet reminders that resilience doesn't always triumph over appearance, and that the strongest plants are often the first to be forgotten. Borage was the kind of plant that did far too much while asking almost nothing in return. It healed wounds, lifted spirits, attracted pollinators, improved soil, and politely reseeded itself without supervision. In medieval agriculture, that level of cooperation was considered suspicious.
Borage grew quickly and happily in poor soil. It didn't complain during drought. It didn't sulk through cold snaps. It produced edible leaves and flowers while quietly supporting neighboring crops. Farmers noticed that fields containing borage seemed healthier, more productive, and oddly less dramatic, which was not the agricultural experience medieval systems were designed to encourage. Medical texts adored borage. It was praised for strengthening the heart, calming the spirit, and increasing courage. A bold claim, though medieval medicine was nothing if not optimistic. Teas, poultices, and infusions made from borage reduced reliance on expensive remedies, which once again made institutions uneasy. If people could heal themselves, what exactly was everyone else for? Borage also attracted bees and beneficial insects, boosting pollination naturally. It accomplished quietly and freely what modern agriculture would later attempt with entire industries. That level of efficiency tends to make systems nervous. Then there was the cultural problem. Borage became associated with emotional well-being. It was said to chase away melancholy and encourage happiness. Medieval authorities tolerated sadness. Joy, however, was another matter entirely.
Sadness was manageable. Happiness, on the other hand, made people comfortable. Comfortable people asked questions. So borage was quietly sidelined. It wasn't formally prohibited, it was reframed as decorative, medicinal, or optional, pleasant to have but not necessary. And once something is declared non-essential, forgetting it becomes effortless. As agriculture shifted toward crops that demanded fertilizer, rotation, and constant supervision, borage slipped out of the center of food production. It lingered in gardens, margins, and memory, just not where it could make a meaningful difference. But borage never stopped being borage. It still grows willingly. It still feeds insects. It still restores soil. It still demonstrates that cooperation with nature is possible and deeply inconvenient for systems built on struggle. Borage didn't disappear because it failed. It disappeared because it solved problems too quietly. And history rarely celebrates gentle solutions. Mallow was the medieval equivalent of that neighbor who somehow survives every disaster with a calm expression and a warm pot of soup. Famine? Mallow. Illness? Mallow. Crop failure? Still mallow. It grew everywhere, helped with nearly everything, and asked for nothing in return, which immediately made it suspect. Mallow thrived in poor soil, along roadsides, near houses, and in abandoned plots where other crops refused to cooperate. Its leaves, roots, and flowers were all edible. That alone was excessive. Medieval food systems preferred specialization. One plant, one purpose, one tax category. Mallow ignored all of that and simply fed people in multiple ways. It was also medicinal, which never improved its reputation. Mallow soothed sore throats, eased digestion, calmed inflammation, and generally reduced the number of reasons people needed to visit official healers. A plant that functioned as both food and medicine blurred boundaries authorities preferred to keep rigid. Worse still, mallow was gentle. Its texture softened stews, thickened broths, and made bleak meals feel intentional. Comfort is dangerous. Comfort creates stability. Stable people do not panic on schedule. Mallow was especially valuable during hard years. When grain stores dwindled and fields failed, mallow appeared anyway, quietly filling the gap. It turned forgotten patches of land into emergency kitchens. From an administrative perspective, this was a disaster. Hunger was meant to be leverage. Mallow relieved pressure. So mallow was dismissed as a weed, ordinary, unremarkable, unworthy of attention. This was deliberate. Labeling something common is an efficient way to remove it from serious consideration without explaining why. Medical writers continued to praise mallow quietly, but official agriculture moved on to crops that demanded more labor, more planning, and more oversight. Crops that failed loudly when neglected. Crops that reminded people how fragile survival was supposed to be. Mallow remained, of course. It always does. It grows at the edges, appears during hard times, and fades again when systems regain control. It doesn't protest. It doesn't argue. It waits.
Mallow didn't vanish because it was weak, it vanished because it was forgiving, and forgiving solutions have a habit of undermining rigid systems. Sea kale grew in places medieval agriculture politely ignored: wind-scoured coastlines, pebble beaches, salty soils that respectable crops found insulting. Where wheat failed instantly and barley quit out of spite, sea kale stood firm, thick-leaved and deep-rooted, entirely unfazed by conditions that sent other vegetables into existential collapse. It needed no fertilizer, it tolerated salt spray, it survived storms, drought, and neglect. In other words, it refused to participate in the drama that made farming controllable. Coastal communities relied on sea kale heavily. It provided fresh greens when inland crops failed and returned year after year without complaint. You didn't plow for it, you didn't rotate fields, you didn't negotiate with the weather, you harvested and moved on with your life, which was precisely the problem. Sea kale bypassed the inland food hierarchy entirely. It grew outside managed farmland, beyond easy taxation and routine oversight. Lords controlled fields.
They controlled barns, they controlled grain, they did not control coastlines, and anything that nourished people outside official oversight was regarded as suspiciously convenient. There was also the matter of durability. Sea kale was resilient. Its thick leaves resisted pests and rot. Its roots clung so firmly that storms often failed to dislodge it. This level of toughness undermined the medieval notion that nature required constant domination. Sea kale didn't seek domination, it sought space. Authorities never banned it outright; doing so would have meant admitting its usefulness. Instead, it was labeled wild, coarse, and inferior to proper vegetables, something coastal people tolerated because no better options existed. Over time, sea kale retreated to the margins: dunes, cliffs, forgotten shores, still growing, still edible, still performing exactly as it always had. It didn't vanish, it was simply ignored until it became invisible. Sea kale didn't disappear because it was weak, it disappeared because it refused to be essential in only one way. Versatility is powerful, and power that cannot be neatly categorized rarely survives. Asparagus pea had an identity crisis that harmed its long-term survival. It wasn't quite asparagus, it wasn't quite a pea. It tasted like asparagus when young, produced edible pods later, and refused to conform to a single role. Medieval farming prized clarity. Asparagus pea offered versatility, and versatility made everyone nervous. The plant thrived in poor soil, tolerated heat, resisted pests, and demanded minimal care. It grew where other vegetables sulked, producing edible shoots and pods over a long season. In other words, it did far too much while asking far too little. Peasants valued asparagus pea because it filled gaps. When one crop failed, it persisted. When stores thinned, it helped. When labor was scarce, it quietly carried on. Systems built on control, however, prefer predictability, not resilience. Asparagus pea also stored well and could be harvested in stages. No panic, no sudden scarcity, just steady nourishment, which administrators historically found unsettling. Even worse, it didn't require intensive tilling or strict planting schedules. It didn't fit neatly into rotation systems designed around grain dominance. Anything that disrupted the centrality of grain was automatically suspect. Over time, asparagus pea was quietly pushed aside by crops promising higher yields in exchange for higher dependence, crops that demanded richer soil, better tools, and precise timing, crops that reminded farmers how fragile their survival truly was. Asparagus pea was reframed as odd, old-fashioned, or simply unnecessary. It wasn't fashionable, it didn't scale, it didn't photograph nicely for medieval cookbooks, a tragically overlooked market. Yet, in its quiet way, asparagus pea had been remarkable, smoothing food supply shocks, making hunger less dramatic, and reducing reliance on centralized stores. History, as usual, prefers hunger with spectacle. Asparagus pea didn't disappear because it failed, it disappeared because it refused to be essential in only one way. Versatility is powerful, and power that cannot be neatly categorized rarely survives. Chickweed suffered from the worst branding problem in agricultural history, its name. Call something a weed long enough, and people stop questioning whether it might actually be food. Chickweed, of course, was very much food, nutritious, abundant, and irritatingly reliable. That made the label extremely convenient for those in power. Chickweed grew everywhere. Not metaphorically, literally everywhere. Fields, gardens, roadsides, wall cracks, abandoned lots, places no one had officially approved for life.
It sprouted quickly, spread generously, and remained tender and edible for most of the year. While other vegetables demanded careful planning, chickweed simply appeared, like a friend who brings snacks without being asked. Nutritionally, it was impressive, embarrassingly so. Packed with vitamins, minerals, and real sustenance, chickweed mattered, especially in early spring when stored food was dwindling and hope was in short supply. It quietly bridged the seasonal hunger gap without ceremony, without paperwork, which of course was the problem. Chickweed didn't belong to anyone. It didn't require fields, fences, or tools. It thrived where authority was weakest and supervision was minimal. Peasants could gather it freely, eating without buying, borrowing, or begging. A food that reduced desperation was inherently threatening to systems that depended on it. So chickweed was dismissed, labeled worthless, something for chickens, something poor people ate when nothing else was available. The implication was clear. Respectable people ignored it. And as history shows, respectable people are remarkably easy to manipulate. Medical practitioners quietly acknowledged its benefits. Healers used it, villagers knew its value, but official agriculture had no interest in promoting a plant that solved problems without creating dependency. As farming shifted toward crops that required seed control, fertilization, and oversight, chickweed became inconvenient. You couldn't stop it from growing, but you could stop talking about it. And once something disappears from conversation, it effectively disappears from memory. But chickweed never truly vanished. It kept growing, it kept feeding, it thrived in the margins. Even today, it appears uninvited, reminding us that food doesn't always require permission, and resilience doesn't require invention, just patience and neglect. Chickweed wasn't removed because it was weak, it was ignored because it was unstoppable. History, when confronted with what it cannot control, prefers to look away. Medieval convents were meant to be fortresses against desire. High walls, locked gates, barred windows, and timetables so rigid there was almost no room for thinking, let alone sin. On parchment, they looked airtight. Bishops imagined convents as perfectly sealed jars of holiness, where women floated through life on prayer, silence, and thin souk. Reality, of course, had other ideas. Most nuns did not arrive from some irresistible spiritual calling. Many were placed by families making cold calculations. Noble households sent spare daughters to protect estates. Merchant families viewed convents as cheaper than dowries. Peasant girls were sometimes offered up because there simply wasn't enough food to go around. Once the door closed, these women were expected to live out a vow they had barely chosen for decades until death intervened. Life inside a convent was monotonous to the point of madness. The same prayers, the same corridors, the same faces, day after day, year after year. Silence was enforced, but silence amplifies rather than erases emotion. Affection, jealousy, boredom, loneliness, curiosity, they did not vanish. They pressed against the walls, quietly searching for cracks. Medieval convents were not as isolated as church authorities liked to claim. Confessors came and went, priests heard sins in private rooms, male laborers repaired roofs, dug gardens, delivered supplies, messengers carried letters in and out. Some convents sat directly inside towns, sharing walls with ordinary homes. Others had hidden doors, back corridors, or poorly guarded gates used for errands. The idea that no man ever entered was comforting fantasy, not reality. The Church knew this. Records are filled with anxious warnings, repeated reforms, and ever stricter rules, like someone trying to patch a leaking dam with their fingers. When rules multiply, it usually means people are ignoring them. Not always dramatically, not always scandalously, but often enough to worry bishops who understood one thing clearly: a vow made without choice is fragile. This tension between sacred expectation and human reality shaped everything that followed. Forbidden relationships did not erupt because convents were inherently immoral. They happened because convents were human spaces, built on ideals that ignored how stubborn desire becomes when confined behind stone walls. When outside contact was limited, emotion folded back on itself. Medieval convents were overwhelmingly female spaces, women eating together, working together, sleeping under the same roof, sharing their lives with almost no interruption.
Intimacy was inevitable. The Church promoted spiritual sisterhood, but it rarely defined where closeness ended and something else quietly began. Friendships between nuns could be intense. Letters and convent regulations referenced particular friendships, a phrase that almost always carried a note of concern from church officials. These bonds were not casual. Some pairs insisted on sitting together, working by side, praying in tandem, and becoming visibly distressed when separated. Abbesses were instructed to intervene, not because such attachments disrupted discipline, but because they were feared to lead hearts astray. Church writers struggled to describe what they worried about without naming it outright. They warned against lingering touches, shared beds, whispered conversations after lights out, and gifts exchanged in secret. These repeated admonitions exist for a reason. When rules recur, the behavior they address is rarely imaginary. In convents, where warmth and companionship were scarce, emotional need found willing partners. Not all intimacy was sexual, but medieval authorities often assumed it could turn that way. Emotional bonds were dangerous precisely because they seemed harmless at first. Comfort in illness became dependency. Shared grief became exclusivity. In a world where romantic connection was prohibited entirely, even small gestures carried enormous weight. A hand held too long, a private nickname, a glance known only to two people, these could feel like rebellion. Punishments varied. Some abbesses acted discreetly, quietly separating the women and assigning new duties. Others imposed fasting, isolation, or public penance. A few cases reached ecclesiastical courts, where records spoke in careful, evasive language that avoided specifics while making the implication unmistakable. The Church favored correction over spectacle, especially when men were absent and scandal could remain behind walls. What makes these dynamics striking is not their rarity, but their predictability. Remove men, forbid marriage, enforce silence, and demand lifelong celibacy, and affection does not vanish, it adapts. Medieval convents did not erase desire. They redirected it inward, forming bonds so strong that the Church worried they might rival devotion to God. Stone walls could be crossed, but letters slipped through even more easily. Correspondence was officially allowed, tightly monitored and supposedly innocent, yet often abused. Nuns could write to family, patrons, and church officials, but letters were subject to approval and supervision. What the rules allowed and what actually occurred were often very different. Some letters appeared innocuous, polite greetings, health updates, or promises of prayers in exchange for donations. Yet beneath formal language, meaning could be hidden. Words expressing longing for guidance, gratitude for kindness, or concern for a soul could double as emotional confession. Medieval writers were trained in subtlety, and nuns became masters of it. When passion could not be named, it whispered. Surviving letters reveal intimacy that feels uncomfortably close. Aching hearts, unbearable absence, sleepless nights, delight at the thought of reunion. Some promised eternal remembrance, others begged for replies with urgency far beyond polite correspondence. church authorities noticed. Bishops complained that convent letters resembled love poetry more than spiritual reflection, and instructed confessors to watch closely. Smuggling was rarely difficult. Messengers, servants, visiting priests, and sympathetic relatives often acted as couriers. Letters were sometimes hidden in baskets of food or sewn into clothing. Some convents developed informal networks of trusted intermediaries to ensure safe delivery. Once the practice began, it often escalated. Letters prompted replies, replies encouraged visits, and visits turned rumor into risk. When discovered, letters became dangerous evidence.
Unlike passing glances or whispered words, letters could be read, copied, and preserved. Abbesses were instructed to confiscate any correspondence that seemed suspicious and report it to higher authorities. Some letters were burned immediately to prevent scandal. Others survived precisely because they were seized, catalogued, and stored as evidence of wrongdoing. Ironically, the very act of suppression ensured their survival. Punishments varied. Writers might be confined, silenced, or transferred to stricter convents. In more severe cases, entire houses came under scrutiny, leading to inspections and reforms. Letters revealed not just individual desire, but the vulnerability of the institution itself. They showed that enclosure was never absolute, and emotional bonds could extend far beyond the walls meant to contain them. In the end, these letters demonstrate that medieval nuns were not silent figures frozen in prayer. They were literate, articulate women using the tools available to them. Ink became a quiet rebellion, carrying forbidden feeling where footsteps could not go. If letters slipped through convent walls, confessors walked through the front door with full church authority. Priests were essential to convent life, hearing confessions, celebrating Mass, delivering sermons, providing spiritual guidance. In theory, they were neutral instruments of God. In practice, they were men placed in positions of extraordinary emotional authority over women trained to obey. Confession was intended to purify the soul, but it also created intimacy. A nun spoke alone, often behind a screen, revealing fears, doubts, and temptations to a man sworn to secrecy. Over time, some confessors became more than spiritual advisors. They became confidants, emotional anchors, and in certain instances, objects of affection. Church writers warned repeatedly that private confession fostered dangerous familiarity, particularly frequent or unsupervised. The risk was mutual. Some priests abused their authority, turning devotion into dependence. They framed personal attachment as spiritual guidance, or claimed special bonds were signs of divine favor. Others convinced nuns that obedience to them equaled obedience to God. Church records employ carefully vague phrases like excessive familiarity or inappropriate consolation, avoiding explicit description while leaving the meaning clear. Not all attachments involved coercion. Some grew gradually, built on shared belief, conversation, and vulnerability. A confessor who listened, praised, and encouraged could feel like a lifeline. For priests, attention from educated, attentive women could be intoxicating. When boundaries blurred, both sides risked ruin. The church responded with rules designed to contain risk. Confessors were rotated frequently. Some convents required 2 nuns to be present during spiritual discussions. Others limited priestly visits or prohibited private meetings entirely. These measures were not theoretical, they were reactions to repeated scandals. When relationships were discovered, consequences were severe. Priests could be stripped of office, reassigned, or imprisoned in monasteries. Nuns faced penance, isolation, or transfer to stricter houses. In extreme cases, entire convents were accused of corruption, turning spiritual homes into sites of investigation. What made these situations especially alarming was not only sexual misconduct, but the collapse of hierarchy. A confessor crossing boundaries threatened the structure of obedience on which convent life relied. The line between guidance and control proved easier to cross than the church cared to admit. Rumors of affection could be managed, letters could be destroyed, friendships broken, priests reassigned.
Children were far harder to explain. Medieval records make it painfully clear that pregnancies occurred inside convent walls, rare, carefully concealed, but devastating when discovered. A pregnant nun provided undeniable proof that enclosure had failed. The question was not just how it happened, but how many knew. Concealment required cooperation. Fellow nuns, servants, midwives, and sometimes abbesses quietly played roles. Restricted movement, loose habits, and claims of illness bought crucial time.
In some cases, childbirth occurred in secrecy, often at night, with trusted attendants sworn to silence. What became of the children depended entirely on circumstance. Some infants were quietly sent to relatives, placed with sympathetic households, or left at foundling hospitals. Others vanished from the historical record entirely, leaving historians to speculate about fates that were never documented. A few convents developed remarkably efficient methods for removing evidence before it could reach church authorities. When pregnancies were discovered, punishments could be severe. Nuns were interrogated, pressured to name accomplices. Fathers, if identified, faced penalties, but records indicate that women bore the heavier burden of shame. Some nuns were expelled, sent into public penance. Others were confined to stricter convents, their lives reduced to isolation and silence. In extreme instances, ecclesiastical courts imposed lifelong imprisonment. Publicly, these cases were framed as moral failure. Behind the scenes, however, the responses reveal a more complicated reality. Church authorities were often reluctant to expose scandals fully. Bishops weighed punishment against reputation, preferring discretion when public outrage might threaten donations or political alliances. Quiet resolutions were valued. Justice was negotiable. Appearances were not. These hidden children revealed the contradictions at the heart of convent life. Celibacy was mandated, yet choice was often absent. Surveillance was strict, but never complete. Women were blamed, but institutions quietly adjusted to protect themselves rather than the individuals. The convent did not merely fail these women, it absorbed the consequences and erased them behind stone walls designed to separate holiness from flesh. Life persisted. Crying infants, hastily arranged removals, and rewritten records testify to a reality the church could not fully control. Vows could be enforced, but biology and emotion proved far less obedient. Medieval convents appeared sealed, yet archaeology and contemporary records suggest a far more porous reality. Enclosure looked impressive externally, yet it relied on human discipline rather than perfect barriers. People predictably found loopholes in stone. Many convents featured secondary entrances for practical purposes: food deliveries, waste removal, repairs, or medical emergencies. Over time, these practical doors became routine, then invisible, and quietly exploited. A back door used weekly became a door no one questioned. A key held for emergencies became permanent. Perfect enclosure existed mostly in sermons. Some convents shared walls with surrounding towns. Windows looked onto streets, roofs connected to neighboring buildings. In some documented cases, tunnels and passages ran beneath convents, initially for drainage, storage, or escape in siege. Later rumors claimed other uses. While not every story of secret tunnels is true, surviving evidence confirms that some convents were far more permeable than their rules suggested. Servants played a critical role. Unlike nuns, they were not cloistered for life. They moved between convent and town, carrying messages, supplies, and gossip. Trust in them was necessary, but trust also created opportunity. A discreet servant could arrange meetings, deliver letters, or simply look the other way. Silence had a price, and medieval society excelled at informal transactions. Abbesses were often aware of these weaknesses. Some enforced discipline rigorously, sealing doors, rotating staff, and reporting suspicions.
Others opted for pragmatism, understanding that rigid enforcement risked rebellion or unwanted scrutiny. A controlled leak was sometimes preferable to an explosion. As long as scandals remained quiet, order was maintained. When church inspectors arrived, convents transformed. Suspicious doors were temporarily blocked, routines tightened, nuns coached on what to say and what to forget. Inspections were often announced in advance, giving communities time to prepare. This was not corruption so much as institutional survival. The myth of perfect enclosure mattered because it protected authority. If walls were truly impenetrable, any scandal could be blamed on individual sin. Admitting structural weaknesses would have required acknowledging that the system itself was unrealistic.
And so the church clung fiercely to the image of sealed sanctity, even as doors creaked open and closed in quiet defiance behind it. Stone walls could stop feet, but they could not halt intention. Medieval convents were not breached by dramatic escapes or romantic intrusions, but by countless small compromises, repeated until enclosure existed more as a concept than a reality. When forbidden attachments surfaced, the church faced a delicate dilemma. Public punishment asserted moral authority, but public scandal threatened reputation, donations, and political alliances. The solution was selective justice, strict enough to deter, subtle enough to contain. Discipline was never about fairness, it was about control. Minor transgressions were generally handled internally. A nun suspected of excessive closeness might be reassigned, separated from companions, or subjected to fasting and extra devotions. Silence was a preferred instrument. Being forbidden to speak, sing, or participate in communal life for months or even years was far from mild. In a world constructed around shared ritual, silence was erasure. Graver cases escalated to ecclesiastical courts. Proceedings were intentionally vague. Records spoke in euphemisms like grave misconduct or breach of chastity, avoiding explicit detail. The goal was never truth for its own sake, it was the restoration of order. Confessions were extracted, penances assigned, and documents locked away. Justice operated behind closed doors, mirroring the secrecy of the offenses themselves. Status shaped outcomes. Convents with noble patrons often faced gentler handling than poorer rural houses. Influential families could intervene, requesting transfers rather than expulsions. Abbesses from powerful lineages negotiated directly with bishops. Lower status nuns, by contrast, bore the brunt, becoming convenient symbols of moral decay. Men, when involved, were treated differently. Priests might be quietly reassigned, disciplined, or sent elsewhere. Public disgrace was rare unless containment had already failed. Women carried the visible burden. Their bodies provided evidence. Their reputations were easier to sacrifice. Silence extended beyond punishment. Witnesses were discouraged from speaking. Letters were destroyed. Children were quietly removed. Memories were curated. The aim was not merely to prevent behavior, but to erase its very narrative. A scandal forgotten was a scandal neutralized. Ironically, this culture of silence increased the likelihood of repetition. Without open acknowledgement, patterns went unexamined. Reforms addressed symptoms, not causes. Rules multiplied, oversight intensified, yet underlying pressures persisted. Punishment in medieval convents was not about morality, it was about maintenance. The church did not require perfect purity, it required plausible purity. As long as walls appeared intact and voices remained muted, the system could function. Those who broke silence paid not only for their actions, but for the threat their exposure posed to institutional authority. Each significant scandal prompted new measures. Inspections increased, rules were rewritten, sermons thundered against disorder. From the outside, it appeared decisive. Inside, it felt like déjà vu. Reforms did not erase desire, they forced it to adapt. The church repeatedly tightened enclosure. Grills were reinforced, windows screened, visiting hours curtailed, confessors rotated more frequently. Yet every reform revealed an uncomfortable truth. The system depended on perpetual vigilance. Human fatigue proved more reliable than divine regulation.
Some convents collapsed under scandal. When accusations multiplied or evidence could no longer be contained, houses were dissolved. Nuns were dispersed to other institutions, their communities erased as if they had never existed. Official explanations spoke of corruption or spiritual weakness, never structural flaws. Blame remained neat.
Other scandals escaped into the public imagination. Ballads, gossip, and satirical tales circulated about secret meetings, clandestine attachments, and nuns who defied expectation. These stories often exaggerated events, but their endurance mattered. They signaled a shared awareness that convents were not the airtight sanctuaries the church claimed. Everyone knew, the laity knew, the clergy knew, yet everyone acted as if they did not. Ironically, these tales reinforced control. Nuns came under increasing suspicion, and stricter regulations were justified by the assumption that temptation was omnipresent. Women were judged for reputations they had not earned. Innocence became irrelevant. Surveillance replaced trust. Occasionally, reformers acknowledged deeper structural problems. Some pointed to forced vocations as a root cause. Others questioned the wisdom of binding teenagers to lifelong vows. These voices rarely carried weight. Convents remained convenient tools for managing inheritance, family politics, and social order. The institution persisted because it was functional, not because it was compassionate. By the late Middle Ages, cracks in this system were impossible to ignore. Calls for reform extended beyond convent walls, feeding broader critiques of church authority. When the Reformation arrived, convent scandals were seized as proof of institutional hypocrisy. Tales once whispered behind walls became public weapons. Reform often failed because it addressed only behavior, not the underlying lack of consent. Desire was treated as disobedience rather than inevitability. Medieval convents were not uniquely corrupt. They were pressure chambers designed to contain human needs without release. Scandal did not topple them instantly, but it eroded the illusion sustaining them. Once that illusion fractured, it never fully healed. By the end of the Middle Ages, stories of forbidden attachments could no longer be entirely suppressed. Not every convent was morally compromised, but the gap between expectation and reality had become too obvious. The Church continued to insist that enclosure worked in theory, even as centuries of evidence suggested otherwise. The walls remained. The illusion did not. The surviving records reveal not sensational scandal, but humanity. Nuns were not icons. They were women with constrained choices, often committed to lifelong vows before understanding their full implications. Some navigated the system with sincere faith. Others struggled quietly. A few sought human connection wherever it could be found. Their actions were unremarkable by modern standards. What made them alarming was the system around them. The Church framed forbidden relationships as moral failure, but the real issue was structural pressure. Convents concentrated young women, removed choice, suppressed sexuality. When breaches occurred, blame fell downward. Institutions survived by absorbing guilt into individuals and then erasing those individuals from the narrative. Ironically, the Church's efforts to suppress these stories ensured their survival. Court records, disciplinary manuals, confiscated letters, and reformed decrees preserve the very realities sermons attempted to deny. Historians uncover these relationships not by accident. They exist because the institution documented them obsessively, attempting to control what it could not prevent. Convents fascinated and unsettled medieval society because they represented purity under constant strain. When they failed, even quietly, they undermined the broader belief that strict rules could reshape human nature. The problem was never desire itself. It was the belief that desire could be sealed away indefinitely. Later reforms eased some extremes.
Forced vocations declined, education and choice gradually expanded, yet the medieval experiment left a lasting impression. Obedience without consent and silence as proof of holiness comes at a cost. The walls of convents were real, the vows were real, the expectations were real. What was never real was the idea that human connection could be eradicated by stone and rule. Behind locked gates lived people negotiating faith, fear, affection, and survival. Forbidden relationships were not the story itself, they were a symptom. The true story is what happens when institutions demand perfection from humans and punish them for being exactly what they are. In a medieval convent, a vow was never simply a personal spiritual commitment. It was a public contract, spoken aloud, witnessed by church officials, recorded by scribes, and enforced by an institution that treated vows as structural pillars sustaining authority.
When a nun violated a vow, whether chastity, obedience, or enclosure, it was never seen as a personal lapse. It was perceived as a threat. Convents depended on reputation. Donations, protection from local lords, and favor from bishops all hinged on the belief that these were disciplined, sealed spaces of spiritual integrity. One broken vow suggested that the walls were not functioning, that the rules were failing, that authority was slipping. Punishment, therefore, was rarely quiet or forgiving. Discipline was designed not merely to correct the individual, but to reassure the entire community that control remained intact. Unlike secular courts, convent discipline required no juries, lawyers, or appeals. Authority was concentrated, swift, and absolute. Abbesses wielded broad power. Bishops had more. Accusations often rested on rumor, suspicion, or confessions extracted under pressure. Once guilt was assumed, consequences followed rapidly. The objective was containment, speed, and example. Even minor behaviors could escalate. Laughter deemed inappropriate, whispered conversations, refusal to follow orders, or signs of emotional attachment might all be treated as early indicators of moral corruption. Preventative logic dominated. Better to punish before scandal arose than to allow potential decay to spread. A nun did not need to commit a grave offense to face severe discipline. She only needed to make her superiors uneasy. What made convent punishment particularly intense was its permanence. Secular penalties expired, fines were paid, prison terms ended. Convent discipline often reshaped the entirety of a life. A punished nun rarely regained her previous standing. Her movements were restricted, her reputation marked, her future circumscribed. The Church framed this system as spiritual medicine. Suffering cleansed the soul, fear protected holiness. In reality, the structure served a different purpose entirely. Punishment maintained hierarchy, enforced silence, and ensured obedience in an environment where consent was often absent. To break a vow was to reveal a fissure in the system. Punishment existed to seal that fissure, even if it meant crushing the individual who exposed it. In medieval convents, discipline was never about forgiveness. It was about control. Control, in fact, was sacred. When convent authorities sought to discipline without drawing public attention, they relied on isolation. Solitary confinement was one of the most common and effective punishments, precisely because it left no visible mark. A nun could be physically present, yet socially erased, removed from the community without disrupting the appearance of unity. Isolation spaces varied. Some were small rooms on the periphery of the convent, others were repurposed storage areas or crude stone closets. Light was minimal, heat inconsistent, and winter confinement could be dangerous. A straw mattress, a wooden stool, and a prayer book were often all that remained. Silence was strictly enforced. The punished nun could speak only in prayer, and sometimes not even then. Meals were passed through doors or left at her feet. Confession, if permitted, was brief and tightly controlled. Human contact was minimized, causing days to blend together. This design was intentional. Silence functioned as both penance and pressure. Officially, solitude was described as spiritually restorative. Alone with God, the sinner would reflect, repent, and reform. In practice, the effects were often psychological. Nuns accustomed to communal routines and constant engagement faced emptiness. Anxiety, despair, and even hallucinations were common, though rarely documented. Isolation also conveyed social meaning. Removing a nun from the community marked her disgrace. Others noticed her absence. Mystery amplified fear. Duration varied, from weeks to months, sometimes years. Release depended on perceived obedience, confession, or the judgment of superiors. There was no standard. The uncertainty itself was a form of punishment. Unlike secular imprisonment, convent isolation had no external oversight. Conditions went unchecked. No one measured harm. The abbess's authority was absolute. What was framed as spiritual correction became a tool of total control. Solitary confinement rarely corrected behavior, it erased resistance.
When a nun returned to the community after punishment, she did so subdued, watchful, and acutely aware of her exposure. Silence had done its work. When silence failed to secure compliance, hunger followed. Food restriction was among the most immediate, visible, and humiliating forms of discipline in medieval convents. It required no chains, no cells, and no witnesses beyond the dining hall. A nun placed on a bread and water regimen bore her punishment on her body. The diet was literal: coarse, often stale bread and water, sometimes rationed, without vegetables, broth, or wine. Its duration varied, lasting days, weeks, or longer, depending on the perceived gravity of her transgression. In an era when meals were already meager, this reduction quickly sapped strength. The goal was rarely to starve in the modern sense, it was to enforce submission. Hunger sharpened obedience. A weakened nun lacked the energy to resist, argue, or defy authority. Officially, the diet was framed as imitation of Christ's suffering, a lesson in humility. In practice, it was physical pressure masquerading as spiritual exercise. The punishment was often semi-public. While other sisters ate normally, the punished nun sat apart or received her bread silently. Explanation was unnecessary. Shame did the rest. Hunger isolated without removing the punished body from view. Health consequences were frequent, particularly for younger or already frail nuns. Fainting, dizziness, and prolonged weakness were quietly tolerated. Complaints were interpreted as defiance, not distress. A body that faltered was proof of guilt rather than suffering. Bread and water diets were also strategic. They could precede confession, accompany interrogation, or follow suspicion without evidence. Hunger softened resolve and encouraged penitence that might otherwise be withheld. Unlike secular fasting, these measures were compulsory. Refusal intensified discipline. There was no appeal. Her body became a tool of authority. Controlling food controlled thought, energy, and will. Hunger narrowed focus, reduced identity to compliance, and enforced obedience without overt violence. In medieval convents, cruelty required only patience, bread, and water. When authorities wished to make punishment visible, they turned to public penance. Unlike confinement or hunger, this relied entirely on exposure. Shame was the instrument, not a byproduct. A nun undergoing public penance performed acts of submission before the community.
She might kneel during services while others stood, lie prostrate on the stone floor, or confess her faults aloud in deliberately vague yet unmistakable terms. Sometimes she wore distinctive clothing, a coarse habit, missing veil, or a badge marking disgrace, signaling her separation from the rest of the convent. These rituals followed a strict choreography: accusation, submission, and conditional forgiveness. The community observed in silence. Compassion risked misinterpretation as defiance. The lesson was explicit. Hierarchy endured through humiliation. The abbess or superior demonstrated authority. Mercy flowed downward, not negotiated. Even after hunger or isolation, public penance confirmed that the nun had been subdued and reintegrated under control. The psychological effects were profound. Reputation within a convent carried immense weight. A punished nun was marked not just by memory, but by ongoing vigilance, the knowledge that every gaze could measure compliance, and that obedience had been hard-earned through suffering.
Communal life in a convent relied on trust, shared ritual, and cooperative labor. Public humiliation shattered that fragile equilibrium. A nun who had been punished carried her disgrace long after the formal ceremony ended. Glances followed her. Conversations faltered when she approached. Silence trailed her through corridors. Theoretically, public penance was meant to purify both the offender and the community. In reality, it reinforced fear. Every witness learned that their own security depended on obedience. Even harmless actions were treated cautiously. Affection was restrained. Words were measured. The system policed itself through memory. Public penance was also unevenly applied. Convents with powerful patrons could limit its visibility to avoid scandal. Families of influence negotiated discretion. Poorer nuns, lacking protection, were more likely to become examples. Status dictated consequences. By converting discipline into ceremony, the Church transformed punishment into theater. The body was the stage, shame the lesson, and silence the audience. In medieval convents, public penance did more than correct behavior. It taught everyone watching just how precarious their position truly was. When convent authorities judged a nun untrustworthy yet could not safely release her, they imposed one of the harshest penalties: permanent enclosure. This punishment was quieter, colder, and far more absolute than public penance. Permanent enclosure confined a woman to the convent for life, stripping her of privileges and freedom within the very walls meant to provide sanctuary. Unlike standard cloistered living, this was restrictive even by monastic standards. Movement was tightly controlled. Participation in communal worship, meals, and work was limited or forbidden. Some nuns were confined to specific wings, denied access to the choir, refectory, or garden when others were present. They prayed alone, ate alone, labored alone. The convent remained around them, but they were no longer part of it. Permanent enclosure was not exile, it was containment. Expelling a nun risked scandal. Releasing her into secular society raised questions about authority and protection. Keeping her inside, hidden and controlled, solved both problems. The institution remained intact. The transgression disappeared from view. The impact was severe. There was no end date, no promise of restoration. Unlike temporary penance, permanent enclosure offered no redemption narrative. Life contracted to routine, faith without fellowship. This punishment was frequently imposed for repeated disobedience, sexual misconduct, or transgressions perceived as threatening the convent's reputation. Proven guilt mattered less than perceived risk. Any woman seen as defiant, unstable, or dangerous could quietly vanish from communal life. Church records rarely documented the emotional consequences. They did not need to. Permanent enclosure achieved the primary goal of convent discipline: silence. The punished nun ceased to be a problem because she ceased to be visible. Unlike secular imprisonment, permanent enclosure had no legal challenge, no appeal, no oversight. Once imposed, it was nearly irreversible. A nun could spend decades behind the walls that once promised safety. In medieval convents, permanent enclosure was not correction, it was erasure, a life reduced to compliance through isolation until resistance exhausted itself.
Expulsion, by contrast, was for cases that could not be contained quietly. Unlike enclosure, which concealed failure, expulsion exposed it. To be cast out of a convent was more than losing a home, it was a social death sentence. Expelled nuns lost protection, identity, and status instantly. They were stripped of their habit, sometimes publicly, sometimes privately, but the symbolic effect was the same. The habit marked belonging. Without it, they became precarious, trained for religious life with no clear place in the secular world. For many, expulsion was catastrophic. Families had placed daughters in convents often because they could not support them or did not want them back. Dowries were gone, and with them, social safety.
Marriage was effectively impossible for an expelled nun. Returning to society, she carried suspicion, stigma, and few practical skills beyond prayer, literacy, and domestic labor. Survival depended on charity or the mercy of relatives, many of whom had long since written her off. The church did not expel lightly. The threshold was high. Scandal had to outweigh risk. Sexual misconduct had to be visible, repeated disobedience measured, or persistent refusal to submit to discipline demonstrated. Sometimes expulsion followed failed attempts at confinement or penance. Sometimes it was immediate, decisive, and unforgiving. Ironically, expulsion served the institution as much as it punished the individual. Removing a problematic nun shifted blame onto her alone. The convent remained untainted. The system remained intact. The expelled nun became the story, not the structure that shaped her. Many disappeared into poverty. Others joined informal religious communities, hospitals, beggar hospices, or households willing to overlook their past. A few managed to reinvent themselves entirely, but the historical record is mostly silent. Expulsion erased people from history as completely as enclosure erased them from sight. Unlike secular punishment, there was no rehabilitation, no restoration of status, no pathway back. Once expelled, a woman existed outside both church and society, belonging fully to neither. Expulsion revealed the limits of medieval mercy. When discipline failed, compassion ended. The convent closed its doors, along with any obligation to the life it had helped shape. Expulsion was not merely punishment, it was sanctioned abandonment, formalized by authority and sealed by silence. When vows were broken, punishment was rarely equal. The church preached endlessly about sin, but discipline followed hierarchy. Nuns almost always paid more than men involved. If a priest, confessor, or cleric were implicated, consequences diverged sharply. Men were often quietly reassigned, transferred to another parish or monastery, or given mild penances that left careers intact. Their authority was framed as compromised, not their character. Silence completed the work. Nuns had no comparable escape. Their bodies, pregnancies, and reputations made guilt visible in ways male transgressions never were. Even when coercion was suspected, responsibility fell downward. Church records rarely describe seduced men. They describe fallen women. Language erased power imbalances while preserving male authority. The inequality was structural, not accidental. Clergy were assets, managing sacraments, parishes, and church operations. Nuns, by contrast, were contained dependents. Their value lay in obedience and invisibility. When conflict arose, institutions protected what they needed most. Punishment also reflected assumptions about temptation. Church writers routinely depicted women as morally weaker, more emotional, and more susceptible to desire. This belief justified harsher discipline. If women were naturally unstable, then strict control became mercy in disguise. The logic was circular and devastating. Even within convents, class shaped outcomes. A noble-born nun might face confinement rather than expulsion, shielded by relatives who could intervene. Poorer nuns lacked such protection. They became convenient examples, absorbing punishment to reassure authority. The injustice extended beyond the act of discipline, into memory itself.
Men involved in scandals often vanished from the record, unnamed, untraced. Women, by contrast, remained documented in painstaking detail. Their punishments, confinements, and humiliations were preserved. Male responsibility faded. History remembers imbalance because the system recorded it. Unequal punishment was not a flaw, it was a feature. Control functioned best when fear flowed in one direction, ensuring nuns bore the full weight of transgression. In medieval convents, justice was never blind. It knew precisely who could be sacrificed. One striking aspect of convent discipline was its severity, often exceeding that of secular courts. Outside the cloister, even serious offenses were subject to laws, time limits, negotiation, or pardon. Inside, punishment was absolute, personal, and enduring.
Inside the convent, discipline was absolute, open-ended, and shielded from outside scrutiny. A woman accused in a secular court could appeal to family, local custom, or flee. A nun had none of these options. Once enclosed, she entered a parallel legal universe where abbesses and bishops acted as judge, jury, and arbiter of her social existence. Punishment was measured not in days, fines, or formal sentences, but in obedience and submission, concepts without clear limits. Secular prisons, harsh though they were, remained legible to society. Convent discipline was framed as correction, spiritual medicine. Duration and intensity were not constrained. Suffering could persist indefinitely, and a nun's breakdown was taken as proof of guilt rather than excess. Outside the cloister, a woman accused of sexual misconduct might endure shame or a fine, yet retain mobility, family support, and the chance to rebuild. Inside, a nun could face lifelong enclosure, erasure, or expulsion. The Church punished not merely the act, but the very identity. This severity was deliberate. Convents relied on strict discipline to maintain the illusion of sanctity. If vows could be violated without dire consequence, the system itself weakened. Fear preserved order. Punishment safeguarded authority. Ironically, the Church's insistence on internal discipline sometimes protected nuns from secular violence, but at the cost of freedom. Public execution or corporal punishment might be avoided, yet submission came in the form of prolonged suffering behind stone walls. Mercy and cruelty were inseparably entwined. The absence of external oversight made abuse easy. Complaints were treated as defiance. Appeals disappeared into hierarchical silence. Convent punishment became self-justifying, invisible, indefinite, and unchallengeable. Unlike secular courts, it left no public record of cruelty, only obedient compliance, and in its quiet way, this made it profoundly effective. The cloister promised protection from the world. For punished nuns, it delivered something far grimmer, a justice system without exit. At the end of every punishment lay a singular, unspoken objective: fear. Medieval convent discipline was not intended to teach moral insight or cultivate virtue, it existed to prevent repetition. And fear, carefully cultivated, proved more reliable than faith. Each punishment, whether isolation, hunger, public humiliation, permanent enclosure, or expulsion, served a dual purpose. It corrected the individual while educating the wider community. Consequences were rarely spelled out, yet fully understood through absence, silence, and whispered knowledge. Fear shaped behavior before vows were ever broken. Friendships were limited. Speech was moderated. Emotional attachment became risky. Nuns learned to police themselves, not from agreement, but from the imperative of survival. Discipline was most effective when it no longer needed to be applied. Severe, unpredictable punishment preserved institutional stability. Authority required no threat, it had been internalized. Obedience became instinct.
The tragedy was that fear outlasted guilt. Even nuns who never violated vows lived under constant self-surveillance. Joy was suspect, affection dangerous, silence safety. Compliance was manufactured not through devotion, but through anxiety. Church writers praised this as order. Historians recognize it as control. Pain left no marks visible to inspectors. Fear left no records. It existed in behavior, shaping identity, relationships, and daily life. Punishment in medieval convents was not exceptional, it was foundational. The threat mattered more than the act. Most nuns obeyed not because they were saints, but because they understood the alternative.
In the end, the discipline of convents exposes an uncomfortable truth. Institutions that demand perfection often rely on fear to uphold it. The walls remained intact, the rules endured, but what they truly protected was not only purity, it was authority, reinforced by the tacit understanding that breaking a vow could cost everything. In antiquity, love was rarely sentimental or tender. It was understood as a force capable of disrupting households, bending reason, and unraveling carefully arranged lives. Desire was not romanticized as destiny, it was feared as chaos. Ancient thinkers did not ask whether love was beautiful, they asked how to survive it, control it, or weaponize it. Greek and Roman writers often described love as a form of illness that entered the body uninvited. Plato compared it to madness, while physicians cataloged symptoms of lovesickness: insomnia, loss of appetite, obsession, trembling, melancholy. If love could make the body sick, then it could also be treated. This understanding laid the groundwork for aphrodisiacs, charms, and elixirs designed to spark, redirect, or intensify desire. Attraction was thought to operate on multiple levels at once, through bodily fluids, breath, scent, and heat, influenced by divine forces, Aphrodite, Osiris, and later Venus and Cupid, who struck without warning. If the gods provoked desire, human intervention became both logical and necessary. Marriage was often arranged. Illicit affairs could mean social ruin, while a successful seduction could reshape inheritance, alliances, or political power. Winning affection was strategic, not purely personal. Markets sold roots, powders, animal parts, and wines claimed to influence desire, and midwives, healers, and wise women served as consultants in the matters of the heart. Recipes circulated quietly, often disguised as medicine or devotional practice. Some preparations promised irresistible attraction. Others claimed to restore waning passion or permanently bind a lover. Effectiveness, by modern standards, mattered less than belief. If desire had physical effects, ingesting or applying the right substance seemed rational. If it was magical, ritual mattered as much as chemistry. Love became something that could be brewed, swallowed, worn, or whispered into existence. In a world where romantic certainty was elusive, aphrodisiacs offered the illusion of control over a dangerously unpredictable force. Love was to be managed, not trusted. Few aphrodisiacs in antiquity inspired the same mixture of fascination and dread as mandrake. This gnarled root, often resembling a human figure, occupied a liminal space between medicine, magic, and nightmare. To ancient eyes, mandrake seemed almost alive. Greek and Roman writers credited it with extraordinary sexual and emotional potency. Its humanoid form made it a natural candidate for sympathetic magic, the principle that like affects like. Mandrake was believed to awaken lust, restore fertility, and bind lovers together irresistibly. Harvesting it, however, was perilous. Legends claimed the root screamed when uprooted, a sound so lethal it could kill any who heard it. To mitigate the danger, elaborate rituals were observed. Dogs were sometimes harnessed to pull the root, while the harvester remained at a safe distance, ears protected.
Whether the scream was truly deadly mattered less than the performance of the ritual itself. Once obtained, mandrake could be used in myriad ways. It was dried and ground into powders, steeped in wine, or mixed into ointments. Small doses were believed to ignite desire or induce deep sleep. Larger doses could cause hallucinations, paralysis, or even death. These risks enhanced its reputation. A substance capable of harm was assumed capable of seduction. Mandrake blurred the line between love potion and poison, a duality that made it valuable for both seduction and control. Some recipes sought to inflame passion, others to dull resistance.
The distinction often lay in dosage rather than intent. Love in antiquity was not always mutual, and women were frequently linked to mandrake use, especially in literary sources authored by men. The root became a symbol of hidden female knowledge, entwined with sexuality, fertility, and manipulation. Yet men pursued it with equal fervor, hoping to restore virility or secure affection. Mandrake's power rested as much in myth as in its chemistry. It embodied the ancient belief that desire could be summoned directly from the earth. Love, like the root, had to be unearthed, wrestled from the soil, and handled with care, or it might turn against the handler. If mandrake represented mysterious, seductive desire, bull's blood exemplified something far more aggressive. In antiquity, the bull symbolized ultimate masculine force, strength, fertility, dominance, and untamed energy. Consuming anything derived from the bull was believed to transfer these qualities directly into the body. Blood, the essence of life itself, was considered especially potent. Ancient texts describe bull's blood in unsettling ways. Some present it as an aphrodisiac capable of inciting overpowering sexual desire. Others warn that it is lethal. Both interpretations coexisted, reinforcing its reputation rather than undermining it. A substance powerful enough to kill was presumed capable of immense potency. Love and death were imagined as close companions. In reality, actual bull's blood was hazardous to consume due to coagulation and toxicity. Physicians knew this, which suggests that many elixirs were symbolic, diluted, or substituted with safer bull-associated ingredients, organs, fat, or wine, ritually consecrated. Biological accuracy was secondary to symbolic transfer, strength in, weakness out. Bull imagery dominated fertility rituals across Greece, Rome, and the Near East, where sacrificial blood was offered to gods of reproduction and desire. Consuming or touching consecrated liquid was believed to channel divine potency directly into the participant. Within this framework, aphrodisiacs were as much religious acts as chemical interventions. Unlike mandrake, bull's blood was explicitly tied to male sexuality, promising dominance rather than mutual attraction, conquest rather than persuasion. The aim was not to be loved, but to be irresistible. This highlights an uncomfortable truth. Many ancient aphrodisiacs were not designed to cultivate shared intimacy. They were intended to overcome reluctance, fatigue, or social barriers. Desire was to be provoked, even imposed, rather than negotiated. Tales of bull's blood frequently function as cautionary myths. Men who sought unnatural potency often met tragic ends, consumed by the very force they attempted to harness. Desire amplified by coercion threatened body, mind, and social order alike. If mandrake and bull's blood occupied the dangerous extremes, oysters were a far safer expression of desire. They were sensual without appearing magical, luxurious without seeming threatening, and most importantly, edible. Oysters became the socially acceptable face of erotic indulgence. Their association with the sea connected them to Aphrodite, born from ocean foam. Anything drawn from the water carried inherent erotic symbolism. Hidden within rough shells, revealed only when pried open, oysters seemed designed for metaphor. Ancient writers rarely resisted the analogy. Modest and plain on the outside, soft, moist, and suggestive within. Greek and Roman elites believed oysters stimulated desire through abundance, richness, and rarity. Transported live over long distances, served fresh at elaborate banquets, their allure lay as much in excess and ceremony as in taste itself.
To eat oysters was to signal wealth, leisure, and indulgence, conditions believed to encourage romance. Unlike the more extreme aphrodisiacs, oysters did not promise transformation, they promised readiness. A body well fed, warmed with wine, and softened by comfort was thought more receptive to pleasure. Desire was not forced, it was coaxed into being through ease and indulgence. Roman writers such as Pliny the Elder praised oysters for their invigorating effects, while satirists mocked men who consumed them obsessively to boost sexual stamina. The humor worked because the cultural understanding was universal. Everyone knew the purpose of oysters, even if no one said it aloud. Oysters also allowed women to participate without arousing suspicion. Drinking mandrake wine raised eyebrows. Serving oysters at a banquet did not. This made them socially useful. Desire could be cultivated subtly, without appearing desperate or dangerous. Aphrodisiacs were most effective when they blended seamlessly into everyday life. Yet even oysters carried moral tension. Excessive indulgence was associated with decadence, softness, and the erosion of self-discipline. Philosophers warned that constant sensory stimulation weakened character. Desire, once awakened too easily, became difficult to restrain. Even the safest aphrodisiac carried risk. Oysters reveal something essential about ancient love culture. Not all desire was summoned through spells or potent roots. Much of it was nurtured through environment, status, and sensory pleasure. The ancient world understood what modern discussions sometimes forget. Attraction thrives when the body feels secure, fed, and indulged. In the end, oysters offered no magic, only mood, and in antiquity, mood was half the battle. Beyond roots, blood, and seafood, lovers turned to something far less tangible: magic. Love was not only consumed, it was invoked. Elixirs, charms, and whispered formulas created a shadow economy of desire operating at the edges of religion, medicine, and superstition. These preparations rarely relied on a single ingredient. Recipes combined herbs, wine, honey, oils, ash, hair, nail clippings, and bodily fluids. Efficacy was measured not in taste or safety, but in symbolism. Honey for sweetness, wine for warmth, hair for personal connection. Each element represented intention made physical. Words mattered as much as substances. Surviving magical papyri preserve love spells that read like desperate negotiations with the cosmos. Names of gods were repeated, commands were spoken aloud. Some spells instructed their target to feel burning desire, sleepless longing, and unbearable attraction until union was achieved. Love was framed as compulsion rather than choice. These practices cut across social boundaries. Enslaved people, courtesans, soldiers, merchants, and elite women all employed love magic. It thrived precisely because formal avenues of desire were limited. When marriage was arranged and reputations fragile, magic offered secrecy, hope, and intervention. Women appear frequently in surviving sources as practitioners, though this often reflects male anxiety more than reality. A woman using love magic was portrayed as manipulative and unnatural, yet the spells themselves suggest vulnerability. Many sought not domination, but affection, return, or relief from loneliness. Magic was as often a response to powerlessness as it was a tool of control. Elixirs were typically administered covertly, mixed into drinks, applied to skin, burned, inhaled.
Consent was rarely considered. The measure of success was effect, not ethics. Greek philosophers dismissed love magic as deception, and Roman law occasionally prosecuted it as harmful sorcery, especially when obsession or violence resulted. Forbidden tools always seem more potent. What these elixirs reveal is not ancient ignorance, but ancient anxiety. Desire was dangerous, unpredictable, and worth managing by any means available.
Love was unpredictable, dangerous, and socially precarious. Magic offered the illusion of control over something inherently unstable. In a world where emotional freedom was restricted, whispered words, secret mixtures, and hidden rituals felt safer than honesty. Desire was never trusted to arise naturally. It had to be summoned, commanded, or forced into existence. Not all ancient aphrodisiacs were cloaked in ritual or excess. Many belonged firmly to the realm of medicine. Ancient physicians believed that desire, like any bodily condition, could become unbalanced. Too much passion weakened the body, too little signaled illness. Love, when uncontrolled, became pathology. Greek medical writers treated love sickness as a real, diagnosable condition rather than a poetic metaphor. Patients experienced insomnia, appetite loss, obsessive thoughts, and erratic behavior focused on a single person. Doctors diagnosed these symptoms seriously. The body was overwhelmed by heat, dryness, or an imbalance of humors. Treatment varied. Sometimes the cure was fulfillment. If desire caused illness, satisfying it could restore equilibrium. This advice was fraught with danger, especially for women and enslaved people whose consent or circumstances made sexual fulfillment impossible. When union could not occur, physicians prescribed substitutes: wine infused with herbs to warm the blood and soothe nerves, certain foods to stimulate circulation, or baths, massages, and aromatic oils to adjust bodily temperament. Smell was understood as directly influencing desire, bypassing reason. Some treatments aimed to diminish desire rather than encourage it. Love was useful when mutual, dangerous when obsessive. Aphrodisiacs and anaphrodisiacs coexisted, both framed as medical interventions. What stands out is the physicality of the ancient understanding of love. Emotion did not reside in the heart alone. It moved through blood, breath, and temperature. Adjust the body, and the feeling would follow. This medical framing made aphrodisiacs respectable. They were not spells, but prescriptions. Lovers were not indulging whims, they were treating ailments. The language of health disguised urgency as necessity. Lovesickness demonstrates how seriously antiquity took desire. It could heal, consume, or kill. Aphrodisiacs were interventions in a world where love destabilized bodies, minds, and social order. To ignore desire was dangerous. To manage it was survival. Aphrodisiacs never operated in a neutral context. They were embedded in systems of power, status, and inequality. The consequences of acting on desire were uneven. For elite men, failure might mean embarrassment, wasted resources, or ridicule. For women, enslaved people, and the unprotected, stakes were far higher. Accusations of love magic could destroy reputations, invite legal punishment, or justify violence. Acts considered playful in one context became dangerous in another. Women, in particular, were portrayed as secretive brewers of aphrodisiacs in hostile sources, capable of corrupting men unnaturally. These narratives reflected societal fears more than reality. Women often had fewer socially acceptable avenues to pursue desire, resist unwanted attention, or escape arranged unions. Aphrodisiacs and love magic offered leverage, agency, or protection in a world designed to limit them. Enslaved people faced even greater precarity. Their bodies were controlled by others, yet they were blamed for desire directed at or from them.
Aphrodisiacs appear in historical sources as both survival tools and instruments of accusation. A potion might secure favor or safety, while simultaneously providing grounds for punishment. Consent was often irrelevant. Many aphrodisiacs were administered covertly, mixed into food, wine, or oils, blurring the line between attraction and coercion. Ancient culture prioritized effect over agreement. Desire mattered more than consent.
Success was judged by effect, not by ethics. This imbalance explains why aphrodisiacs were simultaneously sought after and feared. They challenged social order by circumventing established hierarchies. If desire could be provoked through chemical or magical means, then class, gender, and authority lost some control. That very possibility rendered aphrodisiacs subversive, even when they were commonly used. Laws occasionally targeted love magic, but enforcement was inconsistent. Punishment followed scandal, not principle, and social status shaped outcomes. Power absorbed risk. Aphrodisiacs expose a fundamental truth about love in antiquity. Desire was never purely personal. It was political, and tools designed to ignite passion revealed who could pursue it safely and who paid the consequences. Not everyone accepted aphrodisiacs unquestioningly. Alongside recipes, rituals, and elixirs ran a current of doubt, ridicule, and skepticism. Philosophers, physicians, and satirists often treated love potions as signs of desperation rather than potency. Greek thinkers such as Hippocrates and later Roman medical writers warned that many so-called aphrodisiacs worked less through chemistry than through suggestion. Belief could shape effect. If a lover trusted that a potion would kindle desire, the body might respond accordingly. The ingredient mattered less than the mind. Desire was psychological before it became physical. Roman satirists exploited this notion for amusement. Wealthy men obsessively chasing virility through oysters, exotic powders, and rare wines became stock characters in moral jokes. These men were mocked as vain, aging, and fearful of decline. Aphrodisiacs symbolized insecurity more than potency. The humor worked because audiences recognized the behavior. Some physicians issued explicit warnings. Substances like mandrake or bull derivatives were dangerous. Love pursued through toxic ingestion threatened health, dulled reason, and encouraged obsession rather than fulfillment. Yet skepticism did not end the practice. Doubt and belief coexisted. Even those wary of specific ingredients often accepted the broader logic. Mood, environment, and expectation influenced desire. A potion might fail chemically but succeed socially, signaling effort, intent, or seriousness. Aphrodisiacs did not need to work consistently to remain popular. They needed to offer hope. In a world where love was unpredictable and rejection costly, any tool that promised advantage retained value. Satire functioned as a protective mechanism. Mocking aphrodisiacs allowed the privileged to distance themselves from vulnerability. Humor transformed anxiety into control. Skepticism, however, was a luxury. Women, enslaved people, and the unprotected relied on these practices strategically, while elites could dismiss them safely. Desire could not be fully controlled, but it could be influenced, and aphrodisiacs occupied the space between hope and delusion, simultaneously feared and trusted, a status that ensured their survival. Ultimately, ancient aphrodisiacs reveal less about chemistry than about fear. Mandrake, bull's blood, oysters, and whispered spells were tools to navigate a world where love was perilous, reputation fragile, and autonomy limited. They offered agency where honesty was risky, consent uncertain, and rejection costly. Success was measured not by effect on the heart alone, but by the perceived control over outcomes. Ancient thinkers did not see love as spontaneous or pure. They saw it as a disruptive force, capable of destabilizing households, politics, and discipline. Aphrodisiacs were interventions designed to manage that force, guiding it toward acceptable or survivable ends. Some ingredients had measurable physiological impact, others worked purely on belief. Most existed somewhere between medicine, magic, and manipulation. The boundaries blurred because antiquity never separated these realms the way modern culture does. Body and mind were inseparable. Expectation shaped experience. Beneath the veneer of romance lies a harder truth. Many aphrodisiacs were not intended to cultivate mutual desire, but to bypass hesitation entirely. Ancient love culture valued results over ethics. Attraction was something to be produced, not negotiated. That logic guided the choice of ingredients and the rituals employed. Yet, for all their danger and manipulation, aphrodisiacs reveal vulnerability. They expose people terrified of being unwanted, aging, overlooked, or powerless. They show longing dressed as ritual, anxiety disguised as confidence. Behind every potion was a person hoping to be seen, remembered, or desired. In the end, ancient aphrodisiacs promised not guaranteed love, but belief. Belief that desire could be guided. Belief that deliberate action could matter. Belief that love, unpredictable, overwhelming, and often frightening, could be nudged, shaped, or summoned. That belief alone was potent enough to endure across centuries.